Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. Welcome to my video series, The Filters of Aurora HDR 2018. In this video series, I'm going to go over each of the 14 different filters that are found in Aurora HDR 2018. One video for each filter. And since this is the first video, we're going to start at the top and we're going to do the HDR Basic filter. Now, before I get into the details of how to do the adjustments in this filter, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the differences between the Mac version and the Windows version. As it stands right now, as of the date of me making this video, there are considerable differences between the Mac and Windows version of the HDR Basic filter in Aurora 2018, HDR 2018. And a cool thing about a Mac is I could run, of course, Mac software on the Mac. And you can see I'm running a Mac with Mac OS X High Sierra. But the neat thing about a Mac is you could also simultaneously run Windows on it. And if you look over here, I actually have Windows running, and I have Windows 10 running. If it would load, it's just taking a second. There we go. Windows 10 running, and I have a version of Aurora HDR running over here. And if you look at the HDR Basic filter in Windows, you could see that at the top it's missing an eyedropper and this drop down. Now, it is my understanding that Skylum Software are going to be doing updates throughout the coming weeks, maybe months, and they'll be making the functionality identical between the two platforms. So hopefully when you're viewing this video, and if you're running Windows, you have an eyedropper and a little drop down here. And if you do, great. It should work exactly as I'm going to show you now. If you don't, stay tuned. Hopefully that will be coming soon to an update. Now, if you do have the Windows version, if you click on Help and you go down here, check for updates, I would do that periodically and it will come up and tell you if an update is available. So remember to do that now and then, and you'll make sure you're using the latest version of the software. Now, let's get into the filter, and I'm going to start with those two things that are missing in the Windows version, this eyedropper and the drop down. Now, the drop down is just your typical white balance drop down that you might have saw in Lightroom or other raw developed software where we have daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent flash. These are similar to what's in your camera. So if you want to use a white balance other than the way your camera actually shot the scene, you could just click on it here. So there's daylight, which is going to be just a little cooler, cloudy, shade, which is considerably warmer, tungsten, which is considerably cooler, fluorescent, and flash. So this is a quick way where you could just pick a white balance that works for you for the scene that you're processing. Now, I'm going to leave it as shot. Another way you could do it, at least if you have a Mac right now, hopefully, again, you Windows folks could do it soon, is use the eyedropper. What you would do is you would click on this eyedropper and your cursor turns into an eyedropper with a little box there. And you can see at the top of the box, it says pick a target neutral. Now, what that means is it wants you to find something that really has no color in it, something that's gray. Optimally, you want to find something that's middle gray or 18% gray. So something that's mid gray. Now, it's my recollection that this scene in this basilica, there really wasn't anything in here that was kind of middle gray. One little tip you could do is move your cursor around, and you can see at the very bottom of the box you have R, G, and B. And you can see right now R is 114, G is 101, and B is 79. Move your cursor around and try to get all three of those numbers as close to 75 as possible. That would be middle gray. Now I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to find it. You're not going to get like all three of them at 75. They're going to be considerably off. But if we just move around like these areas that look a little more gray or a little less colorful in the scene, you might find something that's relatively close. Like here we have 87, 63, and 49. we kind of just, if I inch it around there, there's 112, 90, 69, 107. You could see. So that's about as close as I could get it. Let's go with this, 88, 61, 49. Now again, if this was a perfect world, I'd find something that was 75, 75, and 75. But I don't. So we're going to click on that. And you can see it cooled the scene off considerably. It does look okay, though, to me. So that's one way you could try to dial in a perfect white balance. And as I recall, this is pretty much the way this church looked, or this basilica looked when you were inside. It wasn't as warm as it initially was just a second ago. It was more cooler like this. So I'm going to leave that. Now, a third way you could adjust the white balance is you could just come in and move the sliders. Unfortunately, this is what Windows folks will have to do for now until that update comes through. You could just move the temperature slider until you get the white balance looking the way you want it to look, and complement that with the tint slider. And just to get it so it looks decent, and you'll be all set. Once you're satisfied with the white balance, you could move on to the other sliders. And some of them are very straightforward. Exposure slider. Move it to the right, you're going to increase exposure. Move it to the left, you're going to be decreasing exposure. One note is on any of the sliders, if you want to return them to their default position, just double click on the name of the slider. In this case, you can see I have exposure turned way up. I'll double click on exposure and it resets it to its default position. The next slider is contrast. Move it to the right and we're going to add contrast. Move it to the left and we're going to take away some contrast. This image maybe just add a tiny bit of contrast. The next slider, HDR Enhance. For those of you that use Lightroom, this is pretty much equivalent to the clarity tool in Lightroom. It's going to add some mid-tone contrast, which will give you an effect of making it look like you're increasing the sharpening of the image. You're not really, but that's what it kind of looks like. So we're going to move this to the right, and you could see as I move it to the right, it increases the mid-tone contrast, which gives you the effect of making it look like we have a sharper image. Now what I found, on some images you could take this and move it way up and it still looks pretty good, and this image does look pretty good. On other images you might just move it just a tiny bit, and then anything more and it starts looking that kind of HDR look, that over processed, over sharpened look. So be careful with this slider. If you move it to the left, you'll take away some of that mid-tone contrast and you'll be presented with a softer image. So there might be some instances where you want that. For this image, I'm just going to turn it up slightly, maybe to 60. Now the next slider, Smart Tone, it's been my experience. On some images it works brilliantly. On other images it's horrible. This specific scene, it doesn't work quite as well as you would like. But really what it does, if you take the slider and you move it to the right, you're going to open up the mid-tones and the shadows. So when I say open up, that means you're going to make them brighter. But if you look up here like at the window at this highlight, it won't touch that quite as much. Now it does do it a little bit. It's making that a little brighter, but not at the same rate that it's making the shadows and the mid-tones bright as I move it to the right. Now, if you move it to the left, what it will do is it will take those highlights and make them darker, but it won't touch the midtones or shadows as much. So it kind of does the opposite. So when we move that to the left, the highlights get darker, but the midtones and the shadows don't get dark as quickly. Right, so that's something you could play with. Now in this image here, I think moving Smart Tone down just a little bit might make it look a little better. Now the next four sliders are pretty much identical to any of those other highlight, shadows, whites, black sliders that you might be familiar with if you use Lightroom or any other raw processor. You would just come in and for highlights, you just move it to the right or left until you like the effect it's doing to the highlights. In this case, these windows are still very bright and I want to bring out some detail, so I'm going to bring highlights down. Shadows, move it to the right and we're going to make the shadows brighter. Let's just move it just a little bit, just a tiny bit. To the right, you move it of course to the left and you'll make the shadows darker. Now the whites and the blacks. There's a real easy way to get a white and black point if you have a Mac right now. Hopefully they again update it so the Windows version is the exact same. But this is for you Mac users only. Hold in the Option key. Click on the whites slider and you can see the entire screen turns black. Now this is identical to Lightroom. If you use Lightroom, you know that this is the exact same thing. If I move the slider to the right, you can see a lot is bleeding through. And you'll see that there's actually several colors, but the main colors are red, green, and blue. If you see red bleeding through, that means you're clipping the red channel. That means that red is losing any detail. If you're clipping green, you're clipping the green channel, and if you're clipping blue, you're clipping the blue channel. If all three of them clip at once, you'll get white. If you get any two clipping together, you'll get another shade. So what you usually want to do is you want to move this, and it comes to personal taste. Some people don't want any clipping at all, so they would move it to the left so nothing is clipping, or at least nothing, almost nothing is clipping. Other people like to have a little bit coming through, a little bit clipping. When I say clipping, that means that in the case of whites, you're making it parts of the image so bright that there's no detail anymore. That means you're clipping the whites. So clipping the highlights. So I think right there is good. Now, similarly for you Mac users, hold that Option key in and click on the black slider, and you'll see this time the screen turns white. And again, this works identical in Lightroom. If I move it to the left, you'll get a lot bleeding through. You can see there's a lot of red and blue coming through, a little bit of green over in here, and then a lot of black. That means all three channels are clipping. My personal taste is I like to have a little bit clipping in the blacks, so right about there. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, you Windows users can't do that little trick of holding in that Option key, but there is something else you could do. So I'm going to go over to this image that is in Windows. What you could do is go up here to the histogram, and you can see on the left there's this little triangle on the left and a little triangle on the right. You can barely see them. You need to click on each of them individually, and you can see that they turn on. When you do that, you might have noticed, it depends on your image, but on this image here you can see all of a sudden now we have this little blue blotches down here, and up here a little bit we have some red. See that? That's showing us where we're clipping. They're called clipping indicators. The red is your clipping highlights, the black is your clipping shadows. So you could turn those on by clicking on those triangles, then come down here and move your whites and your black sliders till you get it so you're clipping the way you want it to clip, or not clip at all if that's the way you want to do it. So as you can see, if I move the white slider to the far right, I'm clipping quite a bit. If I back it off, I'm not clipping at all. So maybe we'll just clip a tiny bit, like right in there. And similarly with the blacks, which is represented with the blue, if I move it to the left, you can see we're clipping quite a bit. If I move it to the right, I could get rid of a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But maybe right in there. Now what you have to remember to do is once you make those adjustments, you turn off these triangles by clicking on them. One nice feature, again, for Mac users, not available yet for Windows users, is you could turn those clipping indicators on and off by hitting the J key. When you do that, you can see now I have the blue coming through. I don't see any red, but if here, let's just go in and take whites to the right. You can see now we got some red. And then I could hit the J key again, and it will turn off the clipping indicators. So that keyboard shortcut is only available, right now at least, for Mac users. You Windows guys, you still just need to click on those indicators, and then you could do the white and black point. Now you could use those also for adjusting highlights and shadows if you want, even exposure. You could turn those on, and that will help you adjust the image so that maybe you're not clipping too much in one way or the other, the highlights or the shadows. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't add that for right now, you Mac users, when you hold that Option key in, it also will make the screen go black for the highlights and white for the shadows. So you not only will it work with the whites and blacks, it works with the highlights and shadows as well. Personally, I don't use the option key for the highlights and shadows. I eyeball the image and adjust highlights and shadows. Then I use the option key for whites and blacks. And then usually I'll micro adjust it from there without holding any key in. So that's the way I personally like to do it. I'm sure you'll come up with a way that works for you. So that's it for this first episode. I'm sorry, this one is a long one because I had to talk about the differences between the Windows version and the Mac version. The next, or versions of the software, I should say. But the next episode should be a lot shorter because the Windows and Mac version are the same for all the other filters. So in episode 2, we're going to look at the color filter in Aurora HDR 2018. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.